Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Today we celebrate our 150th episode in over 4 years of Changing Higher Ed. It's been a wonderful ride, and I'm pleased to have a special guest for this episode, Amrit Ahluwalia, Senior Director of Strategic Insights at Modern Campus and Editor-in-Chief of The Evolution, an online newspaper focused on non-traditional higher education and transforming the post-secondary marketplace. Amrit works personally with every contributor to produce the content that supported the site's rise to becoming one of the top resources for non-traditional higher education. And through that, he's gained some great insights into higher ed and what institutions need to do in this changing marketplace. Amrit joins us today to talk about what's going on in higher ed and how the customer lifecycle model can help higher ed institutions explain and solve their issues around enrollment. Amrit, welcome to the show.
Hey, Drum, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. This is a monumental occasion, at least for me. You are my 150th guest. I can't believe I've had so many different episodes and so many great guests over the past 4 years, so thank you.
Absolutely my pleasure. I appreciate being invited, and thank you for bringing me on for an episode like this. That's pretty exciting.
It is for me as well, and so we're gonna have a great conversation. Before we get into it, please share with our guests a little bit of your background. I mean, you're the editor-in-chief of Evolution, but you've got a lot of other things in your background that are really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm the editor-in-chief of the publication called The Evolution. That's with 3 L's. We're an online publication that's focused on innovative and transformative models in higher ed. And we were launched by a company called Modern Campus in 2011 because there was a lot of sort of innovation and creativity that, especially in the non-traditional side of the post-secondary space, that wasn't getting a lot of attention from some of the more, I guess, established publications in the higher ed space. So we wanted to create an environment where leaders could really come together and share some of those perspectives, almost like, a back hall conversation at a conference, just to talk about the things they were doing, the things they were seeing, and where they wanted to go. I'll be honest, I don't think any of us thought we'd be around for a decade. And in that time, we worked with probably 2,500 leaders or more at colleges and universities across the U.S. We're starting to see some international interest in the stuff we're doing as well. It's really been a fascinating experience.
Well, I can well imagine, just only having spoken to 150 folks and you 2,500. I mean, you see some incredible perspectives out there. What's going on, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. Where are we right now?
No, absolutely. The higher ed space is in a really, really fascinating spot. There's a lot of change that is characterizing the higher ed space today, where I think we have a lot of leaders looking at changes that are happening in terms of students' demand for flexibility, in terms of the desire for more personalized pathways to learning, in terms of, even learners behaving like consumers and thinking of themselves in that context. And I think for a lot of leaders on the more traditional side of the institution, these all seem like kind of new things that happened during the pandemic. But for those of us who've been focused on sort of the broader post-secondary space, I think what we're seeing is a lot of trends we were observing over sort of 10 or 15 years leading up to 2020 that just got accelerated in that 2-year period. There's been a consistent increase year over year in the number of students taking at least one online program. Then everyone got exposed to it during the pandemic, and now that number has skyrocketed because people are recognizing the need for flexibility. As they realize their opportunity to find flexibility in their learning product, I think they're also recognizing that they should have flexibility in what they learn and where they learn and how they learn. And increasingly, I think as the post-secondary funding model has evolved, where, we have less and less funding coming from state and government bodies and more funding coming out of the pocket of learners, whether that's through loans or whether that's through just paying down tuition and fees, ultimately that individual is starting to act more and more like a consumer because at their hearts they are a consumer. Many of them, they're making the biggest purchasing decision of their lives when they choose a college or a university and they enroll in that program. And I think it's kind of fascinating because part of this broad shift has been also on the part of institutions to redefine what they think success looks like. I think we used to think about success in the higher ed space as being butts and seats. It really was about enrollment numbers. And that's how we defined access. We defined access by looking at enrollment numbers and looking at the diversity of the populations that we're enrolling and saying we're an accessible institution or we're not. But now we're starting to recognize that just getting people in the door is a marketing technique. Like that's, getting people in the doors is a gauge of success of your sales team. But the success of the institution has to lie in the success of the student. And I think we're increasingly recognizing that we have to be oriented towards student success at every phase of their engagement with the institution for the institution to be successful. So I'd say that's kind of one of the fascinating things about where we are as an industry today is in that sort of recalibration of what we're prioritizing.
Well, I take away two things from your last comments. One is the pandemic really didn't create crises.
No.
It just uncovered those crises. It's accelerated all the changes that are going on. And what I'm seeing, and what I gather from your remarks, you agree, is we're seeing a lot of business concepts being imported into higher ed.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that distinguishes my firm is we've worked outside of higher ed as well and bring these concepts in. When we were talking the other day, you had talked about the 6 steps in the customer life cycle, and that really resonated, especially from an enrollment perspective. Let's talk a little bit and tell us about that in case folks don't know what that customer life cycle is.
Absolutely. I really think the customer life cycle is something that every higher education leader should familiarize themselves with. It's a concept and a model and a way of thinking about your organization and its engagement with its customer base, in this case, its learners, that can really help to define specific tactics and specific priorities that may not have been recognizable previous to thinking about it. So there's 7 stages really to the customer life cycle. There's the attract phase, engage, convert, retain, loyalty, nurture, and grow. And basically what that means through the attract phase is making people aware of your institution. Engage is really providing them the information they need to make the right buying decision for them. Convert, as the name suggests, is getting them from prospect to customer. Retain is keeping that individual through their buying process. In this case, it would be through the length of their program. Loyalty is through that course of retaining them, building and fostering a relationship with that individual that you then nurture to something greater. And finally, grow is where you expand your relationship with that individual beyond the nature of the relationship you have today. So if we think about that in the post-secondary context, what are we doing to help prospective learners see themselves at our institutions? What are we doing to make it easy for them to find the relevant programming, the career outcomes, the things that our institution can provide? If we talk about convert, our buying processes can be atrocious in the post-secondary space. We can make it very difficult for people to actually enroll.
Really?
You're believe kidding. It or not, and then, I think when we talk about retain, loyalty, nurture, every single person listening to your podcast, when they enrolled at their post-secondary institution, they got there on their first day and everyone's excited, everyone's buzzing, everyone, there's the orientation happens, everyone gets into that auditorium. And then you have a very distinguished individual with a very distinguished jacket with very distinguished elbow patches stand up on stage and say, look to your left, look to your right, one of you won't be here at graduation. And I don't know that that's the inspiring rallying cry that we necessarily want to hang our hat on as an industry. It's embarrassing when you think about it, because what we're basically saying is we, the institution, don't care that 33% of you won't feel nurtured by this institution.
Yeah, we had the same thing at the Naval Academy when we, got there.
Interesting.
My class coming in, the class of 1978. Yes, I'm old. I'm sorry. I just am. We had the largest incoming class ever. It was over 1,500 people. And we had that same thing on I Day, Indoctrination Day, or Induction Day. Look left, look right. One of you three will not be here. And it actually, our attrition rate was well over 33%.
Oh, wow.
We ended up graduating 970 out of 1,525 or something like that. So, yeah, it definitely isn't a good message to say when you get people there
No.
for the first time.
And I mean, what kind of business holds itself up on not serving its customer? I when we talk about the Naval Academy, I think there's a different set of maybe success metrics that are unique, but broadly speaking, especially as a public post-secondary institution, that's an
Yeah.
unacceptable way for us to carry ourselves. And I really, what bugs me about it the most is that we're implying that the student has failed if they don't succeed academically at the institution. But the reality of it is the institution made a bet on that student. They said this individual is likely to succeed here. We're going to grant them access, and then failed the learner. So that's where I think it starts to become really important to recalibrate around this idea of what does success look like for a post-secondary institution, because really it's about providing learners with the tools they need and the support they need to be able to persist through a program, and ideally to create the kind of relationship with them that's going to foster a lifelong learning engagement with that individual, so that when they inevitably need access to upskilling or reskilling or new skill development or new competencies as the labor market changes, their first thought is, well, I have a pretty good relationship with a post-secondary institution, and they have a first thought, best thought to go back to where they graduated from. It's about responsibility.
Let's not lose that thought, because we want to come back to that very clearly.
Absolutely.
But what I'm hearing you describe is a systemic perspective of the talent supply chain coming through your incoming class, all of that, whether it be undergraduate, whether it be graduate, whatever. You've got to look at it from a systemic perspective, i.e., how do you attract people? How do you get them to sign on the dotted line? How do you keep them engaged, enrolled?
Exactly.
How do you graduate? How do you provide them the skills? It's not, pass them from department to department to department. It's who's in charge of making sure these students are successful all the way through the program. Does that make sense?
That's it. That's exactly it. If you're going to adopt a mentality of a customer lifecycle, you have to adopt a mentality of customer service. And let me just head off this next comment at the pass, which is the customer is not always right. If you ask anyone who's ever worked a frontline customer service role, they will also tell you the customer is not always right. So anytime we talk about this concept of customer service in higher education, inevitably that's the first comment that comes back. What are you telling me, the customer is always right? What do I have to just write, stamp a degree and send it to them? No. But what you do have to do is treat them with respect and empathy, which is something that I think, especially in the traditional education space, we've struggled with for a very, very long time, is the idea of, treating students like adults and not like children. So this is where, adopting that customer lifecycle mentality necessitates adopting a customer service mentality that is basically designed to, how do we make every aspect of their life outside the classroom streamlined and easy, so they can focus the limited time and energy that they have dedicated to higher ed on their learning and not on bureaucracy.
That makes so much sense, especially when we start talking about minority serving institutions,
Yes.
first-gen students, trying to develop that sense of belonging within each student that, yes, I can do this. I remember going through my dissertation when I went back to graduate school. It had been 20 years since I'd been in school. I was a physics major, and here I am into what we used to call a bull subject. You fill in the blank for the rest of that. You'd have the technical, and then you'd have the bull subjects.
Sure.
And I was doing management and organization behavior, that type of thing. And it wasn't until I went and saw somebody defend their dissertation that I went, wow, I can do this. That's the sense of belonging. And you've got to build that into this system to make sure people are retained and can be successful.
Absolutely. I mean, at its core, it's just a question of really orienting around purpose. And if the purpose of the institution is to support learner success, then the structure of the student services department, the structure of student communications, all these things have to adapt to being about student success. Something as simple as the website. Your average higher education website is approximately 70,000 pages or more. So, right, which makes sense when you start to break it down,
I'm
because then
sorry.
you're saying like every faculty has a page that's broken down into, say, 8 program areas. Every program area has a page for each of its disciplines. Each discipline then has a page that's broken down. So, you can see how it would start to spin out of control. Now, the question is it the prospect's responsibility to find the exact right web page they need to get the information they want about the program they want to enroll in? Or is it the university's responsibility to make it easy for them to find the right thing? Right? Now it's a foundational question that is it's operational. Do you have the technology in place to be able to make your website navigable? But then the prioritization of that comes down to a philosophical question. Do you care? Right? Is that a priority? And I think that's where you start to really see these things flesh out from being, we have in our mission statement that we're student centric, or we are actually student centric, right? When you're communicating with students, are you sending email to them? Because I'll tell you right now, your average student isn't reading their email, or are you sending them a text? When you're planning a campus event, is it a meaningful campus event that's actually designed to help them get better acquainted with the institution, or is it a pizza party because the student affairs department doesn't have budget? So it's these kinds of things that you start to see the rubber hit the road in terms of, well, what's the role of the institution in creating that fluid customer life cycle that actually builds that sense of loyalty, that actually nurtures a relationship, that actually inspires persistence and retention? Because if the institution's expectation is that it's up to the student, then at a certain point, it's failing as an organization. And there's one last thought on this. It's a quote that's resonated with me for years. So I was at a conference just outside Maryland doing a presentation with a fellow named Jim Broomall. And at the time, Jim was the executive director for continuing ed at the University of Delaware. We were talking about this vision for the new higher ed institution and the DNA of continuing ed and the student centricity that's implicit within it. And the comment he made is there's 2 industries on earth that define themselves by exclusivity: country clubs and higher ed institutions, right? And it's a spectacular thought once you really start to dive into it, because it's true. I mean, if you think about the US News and World Rankings, rejection rate on applications is a factor that the more students you reject, the better your institution comes off in the rankings. That's absurd. So I think when push really comes to shove, as an industry, there's a reckoning that we need to go through around what's our role in serving our communities, in facilitating socioeconomic mobility, in creating some kind of impact on the people that we're designed to serve. And I think a lot of it comes back to this idea of, every institution taking a look at what are the stages in a customer life cycle and how would they apply to us and our students. And I think what you'll find in many cases is that you'll have a lot of leaders recognizing there's a gap between the experience they try to deliver and the experience they are delivering.
I saw that in spades with a project that we recently did for a flagship university. A new president came on board and wanted us to do listening sessions so that we could find out what was going on at that university. The perception that administration had versus what the people working there had was like night and day.
I don't doubt it.
You've got to listen, applying holistic or systemic thinking to institutions is you've got to think about who your customer is and find out what their true experience is.
Yeah. Well, without that visibility, I mean, how do you know who you're serving and how do you know what they want?
Exactly. And so let's go through, just briefly, let's go through each of those steps in that customer life cycle. And, just a few sentences on how that interacts with each one, and then we'll get to how we can bring it all together.
Absolutely. Well, I guess I'll start with the tract as we normally would. And really it's about, the customer's like looking for a solution. They're looking for a way to solve a problem that they have. So the institution has an opportunity to position itself as a solution provider. But then that comes down to, well, what's the communication strategy? How's the website designed? How easy is it for them to find the right thing at the right time on the website to be able to move forward?
Yeah. This also is dependent on market research, is
Yes.
it not? You've
Yep.
got to know who you want to be attracting.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to, your SEO strategy has to be dialed in. The program mix
Yeah.
has to be right for the learners that you're trying to serve. And a lot of that comes down to, I mean, going back to your example about the sort of the listening tour, really understanding who your learners are and what they like about the institution, what needs to change. These are the core ways that you can actually define your target audience. I think as an industry, we've all spent so long trying to be Harvard that there's a fair number of institutions that have lost sight of what actually makes them unique and interesting and special and valuable. So the closer we can get to positioning higher ed institutions to really recognizing that they're part of this sort of diverse tapestry of options, as opposed to all trying to replicate one model that works for a very specific segment of students, the better.
Great. Thank you. Next step.
Next step. So that's where you have engage. At this stage, your prospective customers found your website, they're starting to sift through it to find materials that meet their needs, and they're actually starting to dive into it. So the question becomes, we know that the majority of students enroll in a post-secondary program because they have specific career outcomes. How are you communicating those career outcomes from a program page perspective? Are you providing them visibility into possible salary that they could earn, job openings in their area? Are you teeing up relationships with employers? Like, these kinds of things. I promise you, for those of you who are listening even from a four-year institution, that kind of messaging and visibility will make a massive impact on a student's likelihood to actually continue with the next step, which is convert. And at that point, that individual decides they're going to make a buying decision and they decide to go through the registration process. And what we've found here, I recognize if you're enrolling in a degree program, there are some pieces of information that you must ask. There are things that student must do in order to adequately apply for the program. But we've worked with a number of leaders who basically have their enrollment management department and their applications department go through an exercise to define every single step, every single question that they ask an individual to answer en route to enrolling at that institution, and to ask themselves at every stage, is this a piece of information we need, or is this a piece of information we already have? So there's a lot of wheat that can be separated from the chaff as far as that process goes. I'd say if you're listening to this interview and you're coming from the non-credit or continuing ed world, simplify. How simple can or should you make it? How easy are you making it for that individual to provide exactly the information they need to provide and no more? How easy are you making it for them to pay? Are you accepting multiple payment types? Are you legally allowed to take credit card payments? For example, we've worked with some schools that take credit card payments over the phone, which is a big no-no. Are you reliant on people faxing you or sending in checks? I mean, these things are areas where that modernization process has to happen. Because if you're expecting customers to jump through hoops to then spend upwards of tens of thousands of dollars with you, they're simply not going to. If it's easier for them to buy a pen than it is for them to register for your program, you kind of need to take a step back and look at what you're asking them to do. In some cases, yeah, it's going to be more challenging. But realistically, the more someone spends on something, the better quality of experience they expect on the back end. And unfortunately, for those of us in higher ed, frankly, people are getting used to very, very seamless and simple experiences in the consumer world, and we are simply not stepping up to match those experiences.
One thing that I'm going to toss in there is the involvement of faculty in the enrollment and retention process, which is the next where we're going to be getting to.
Yes.
When people think back to their college experiences, most of the time, it's the relationship that they have with a professor or multiple professors.
Yeah.
How do you suggest that you get the professors, the faculty involved in this process?
Yeah, I mean, this is a challenging spot because in many cases that's not true. At every institution, there are faculty members that are so passionate and so committed to their learners that this is not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
However, at scale, it becomes very difficult. I have a friend of mine who's a tenure track professor at the University of Ottawa. Phil, if you're listening to this, I'm shouting you out. And his commitment to his students is spectacular. It's unbelievable. He is so passionate about the people who come through his classes. He does his best to get everyone aligned, everyone on track. and he's a prolific researcher. But he's a prolific researcher because that's how you have to do things in order to progress as a faculty member. I think, unfortunately, we've created an environment that does not necessarily reward faculty for their capacity to develop and maintain relationships with students that are essential to those students' success. Again, we're talking about culture shift, we're talking about mentality shift, we're talking about philosophy shift. Some of that has to be executed in the way that we've designed the profession of higher education instruction, because we call it higher education instruction, but we don't reward people for being instructors in higher ed. Now, there are some schools that are starting to take steps to address this. Arizona State is one example of a school that's established a vertical research track, a vertical teaching track, and then a continuing education and lifelong learning track. And the goal of that is basically to say that, we're not unbundling the institutional environment, but what we're doing is creating a situation where faculty members who are oriented to teaching and want that to be their profession can do that and can be rewarded for it. Those who want to be oriented towards research and be rewarded for that work can be. So it's more about making sure that there's an opportunity for everyone to do the thing that they're passionate about and successful at.
I've even heard some institutions are now granting tenure for teaching faculty. I mean, the typical model is 40% research, 40% teaching, 20% service.
Oh.
And some institutions are moving away from the strict research
That's
requirements.
so exciting to hear. And I think it comes hand in hand with every faculty member has to go through a research ethics course in order to be able to conduct their work as a faculty member. How often are we providing professional development around teaching best practice?
Good point. It needs to be done.
Yep. So that's where, to your point about faculty relationship development, I think it's so critical to involve faculty meaningfully in the experience of students outside of the classroom. It's interesting, coming back to this, the original, the original question, the original point we were talking about around sort of whether trends came out of the blue or accelerated during the pandemic. We all shifted to this sort of remote teaching environment. And I think, people obviously hated it. They took lectures and did them on Zoom. It was terrible. But what was terrible about it wasn't necessarily that it was on Zoom or even at a distance. What was terrible about it is that it threw into sharp relief that our entire teaching model is someone talking at a room full of people that aren't engaged with it. Right? We just happened to do it on the computer and suddenly it clicked. There's no interaction here. Now, really strong online learning is qualified that way because it facilitates peer-to-peer interaction and peer-to-faculty interaction, symbiotic interactions between those stakeholders. That's just good teaching and learning. That's just good pedagogy. So
yes,
it's kind of interesting. We're talking about this idea of things that, accelerated during the pandemic, things we kind of realized over that 2-year span. In the continuing ed world, in the online ed world, this is not a new idea. This is something that they've been pursuing and working towards for decades. But it became very evident during that 2-year period that our approach to teaching and learning was very outdated. I think, you can really make the case for greater faculty involvement in that retention effort.
And so the retention piece is also part of the customer life cycle.
Absolutely.
It's important.
Yes.
You get them out the door. There's 2 or 3 more important steps
Yes.
with this whole life cycle that many institutions are now just waking up to.
Absolutely. Yes. So we get from retention, obviously at this point, you assume that individual has completed the credential that they enrolled for. Now we get to loyalty. And loyalty is executed on the back of retention. So loyalty is the exemplification of the relationship you've developed with the individual by their tendency to make another purchase. So for Amazon, it's you bought a bunch of pens, now you bought a bunch of paper. That's their metric for loyalty. Now for us in higher ed, it's not quite that simple. But we can look at things like, did that individual come back for a post-baccalaureate certificate? Did that individual enroll in a professional certification workshop? Did that individual come back for some kind of upskilling or reskilling program? Have they meaningfully re-engaged with the institution in a way that's designed around the core purpose of the institution, which is teaching and learning?
Yeah, beyond the fundraising piece of it.
That's it. And I think we look at that, we've looked at loyalty very myopically through the lens of fundraising, but that's kind of insane when you really stop and think about it. Again, if we think about this as a business model, right? So going back to the Amazon example, now Amazon sold you a bunch of pens. And then their next step is maybe a week or two later to send you an email saying, hey, you really liked those pens, right? Throw us a cool $5 just as a thank you for the pens that you got already and that you already bought and paid for. You'd unsubscribe immediately from that email and you'd say these guys are crazy. But that's
Yeah.
literally our fundraising model in higher education. Hey, you bought and paid for a product 3, 5, 10 years ago. When I was an alumni, literally 6 months after my convocation, before I even had a job, I got an immediate email saying, hey, you just graduated. Do you want to donate? Absolutely not. I just paid you. Right? So this is the kind of thing, though. We do this. This is what we do. This is our business model. Students graduate, we ask them to donate because they graduated. And like, yes, we had fun at that football game 20 years ago, but I'm not going to pay you again for a thing I already paid you for. And if we're shifting to this model where higher education is a fungible product, where students are behaving like consumers, we need to treat them that way. And the relationship we have with students is based around teaching and learning. We are teaching and learning organizations. And if that's the case, if our business is learner relationship management, what are we doing to continue fostering that learning relationship with that individual? So we're in an environment that requires continuous education. We need to facilitate greater access to ongoing learning for our alumni and the execution of that enrollment. That's how I look at loyalty.
And I think that's the exact right way to look at it. But it also requires building programs that your
Yes.
graduates want.
Yes.
I mean, you mentioned Arizona State a little while ago. They're doing a fabulous job of creating lifelong learners, people who will come back. You've got to have good credential systems in place, micro-credentials, however you do it, but you've got to be able to tap into the markets that your graduates need, and if they're going to change jobs, to be able to get them the skills and the knowledge that they need to be successful in that new career or that new job.
Absolutely. You know what's interesting here is this is where the disconnect between the complexity of higher ed bureaucracy and the desire for a continuous relationship with the learner really bump into each other. We know the back end of a post-secondary institution is unbelievably complicated. Everyone has their own systems running. There are multiple different lists that all cover the same students, but with slightly different information in each. And it's very difficult for information to pass from system to system to system. Now, from the institution's perspective, we recognize that this is very complicated, and we try to adapt to that reality on a regular basis. But from the student's perspective, if I'm an alumni and I get an opportunity to re-enroll at my alma mater for ongoing education, my expectation is not that I have to go through another 30-step registration process. I already been a student there. The student number should be there. My contact information should be there. Why do I have to put it all in again? Right? But it's just standard practice. So I think where we are now is we're starting to see tighter relationships forming between continuing education, the main campus, and alumni relations to start to simplify that a little bit. And we're also starting to see in continuing education more work being done to create consistent and high quality credentialing frameworks that create a clear taxonomy of what a badge is, what a competency is, what a micro-credential is, what a certificate is, that applies across the institution. These are all important steps, but the next space we need to get to is really in that seamlessness of information transfer between all these various systems that are in place to create a more streamlined experience for that student.
Oh my gosh, you're actually talking about a higher ed institution having a system
Student-centric.
of management that's also, amazing. Well, Amrit, I knew this was going to happen. I mean, we're already well into this. We could keep talking for another hour easily.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't have anything going on, but I'm sure your listeners might.
So we will do this again in the very near
Sure.
future. But as we always do, 3 takeaways for higher ed presidents and boards.
Yeah. I mean, first things first. Well, you know what? Can I do 4?
Sure.
All right. So we're going to do 4 because the first one is
You
subscribe
can
to
even
the
do
evolution.
5 if you want.
First one is subscribe to the evolution. It's evolution.com with 3 L's. The L's stand for lifelong learning. There's a little inside trivia.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
But again, we're publishing on this kind of stuff every single day from your colleagues industry-wide. The second thing to do is to learn about the customer life cycle and its application to higher education. We have a white paper on that topic if you want to learn about it from us. If you want to learn about it from somewhere else, this is freely and widely available information about the customer life cycle, and it's worth understanding it. The third thing is take a good look at your processes and systems. And I mean it. Take a good look at your processes and systems institution-wide, because everything you do should be oriented to serving your learners' success in some way. What we find when folks actually start to do a deep dive into their processes is, for the most part, those processes are more designed around things that made sense 10 or 15 or 20 years ago and then got digitized. But it's not necessarily because that process or that step that learner has to take is actually useful. It's just the way things have always been done. Finally, prioritize and resource continuing education. We run a state of continuing education study every year for the last 4 years now. And one consistent finding is that, continuing ed is something that's prioritized by senior leadership of the institution. It's something that the institution says it prioritizes, but every single year those divisions are under-resourced and still responsible, and increasingly responsible, for institutional revenue and enrollment growth. If you want your continuing education to drive business impact for your institution, it has to be resourced appropriately. It has to have a system designed specifically so that it can attract and engage students in a way that makes sense. And it has to have the flexibility and freedom to operate in a way that requires that very different approach to business management. So I'd say those are my 3 takeaways.
Yeah. Well, there are 4, but that,
One's just a good thing to do, and then the other 3 are takeaways.
are necessary. Yeah. So the rub of this is, if you can engage your students in this life cycle, you will have lifelong learners, you will have lifelong donors, you will have lifelong supporters, which will just continue to feed your enrollment and everything else that you need as an institution.
Absolutely. If I could make one final point on that.
Please.
If you think about higher education through the lens of a business, and you said your business is designed to serve individuals for exactly 2 or 4 years and then never really serve them again, it's a failing business model. Every single business looks very, very closely at the lifetime value of every customer they serve and looks at how to expand and how to build upon that existing lifetime value to create tighter and more ongoing bonds with those individuals. Because, as we all know, it's more expensive to find a new customer than it is to retain your existing ones. So just from a good business sense perspective, finding ways to engage your learners for life is a way to build a sustainable business model that doesn't have the same dips and valleys as being reliant on a short-term traditional life cycle with that learner. We need to think about life cycle in terms of customers, not students.
You can take that one to the bank, folks. Amrit, what's next for you? What's next for the evolution?
What we're looking at right now is along this question of sort of flexibility in the transformation of higher education. We're looking at the intersection of registrars in this broader role. And registrars are they're often relied upon to drive institutional innovation, but also have to balance the restrictions and the challenges of academic program management and the systems that are in use on campus. So our 2023 State of Continuing Education report, we're recording in mid-March now, will come out at the end of March. So our report with ACRO is also in partnership with UPSIA. And what we're going to be looking at is the distinct perspectives of enrollment managers, registrars, and continuing education leaders as it relates to micro-credentials. So where are the shared opportunities and where are the unique challenges? So from the evolution perspective, that's really what we're focused on this year is that intersection.
Super. When will this report come out?
That should be available in late June or early July.
Very good. Well, definitely we'll have you back to talk about it at that point.
Thanks, Drum.
Amrit, this has been wonderful. Thank you, sir.
Hey, all the best.
You too. Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Amrit Ahluwalia, Senior Director of Strategic Insights at Modern Campus and Editor-in-Chief of The Evolution, and for his sharing with us how he applies the customer lifecycle model to higher ed to make sense of what's going on in today's marketplace and how it can help solve today's enrollment problems. This is our 150th episode, and I'd like to give a special shout out to a few people. First, the many guests that we've had in the 4 years of changing higher ed. I truly have been blessed to have made the acquaintance of so many luminaries in higher education, and want to say a special thank you to you all for sharing your thoughts, insights, and most importantly, yourself on the program. I also want to say thank you to our team who makes this all possible. Tamara Taylor of Show Up Strong, who takes care of the website and SEO. David White of David White Voice, my sound engineer, who makes my guests and me sound smart. And lastly, Dorian Martin and Steve Blackman, who take care of the writing. Without all of you, I wouldn't have been able to bring Changing Higher Ed to all we touch. Thank you. Lastly, and most importantly, I want to say thank you to my listeners. We're up to over 2,000 daily downloads of the podcast, an amazing number. And it's all because of your loyalty and interest that we've kept going. Thank you. Tune in next week for my conversation with Dr. Kent Ingle, president of Southeastern University. Under Kent's leadership in the last 11 years he's been at the helm of Southeastern, it has doubled its endowment, doubled the student body, and added more than $80 million in new facilities. For this and many other things, they've been recognized by the Chronicle of Higher Education as one of the fastest-growing private nonprofit baccalaureate institutions in the country. Until next week, I look forward to seeing you then.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.